I'm David Lax, co-founder and managing principal of Laxabanius LLC, and I'm delighted that you've decided to join us for our webinar on social media and negotiation, how social media can kill or enhance your deals. This will be a 30-minute presentation. It will be followed by an optional question and answer session. Not all of you will know that much about Laxabanius LLC. Briefly, we're a consulting firm that does two things. First, we advise companies and governments around the world in complex and high-stakes negotiations. Second, we help our clients build their capabilities as organizations to get consistently better results in certain classes of negotiations. At the heart of our advice and capability building is an approach called 3D negotiation that we developed as Harvard Business School professors and in our roles in investment banking and private equity and as advisors in many complex negotiations. 3D negotiation differs from most of what is taught and written about negotiation and from how most companies actually conduct negotiations. My colleague Jim Sebanius is going to tell you a little bit more about 3D negotiation, but what I can tell you here is that it has delivered hundreds of millions to billions of dollars of measured benefit to clients around the world. What brings us here today is the important advent of social media. Digital media has disrupted everything about business, from marketing and sales to business strategy, procurement, learning and development, customer service, even government relations. But from what we can read from academics and business professionals writing about negotiation, and from what we see from our clients conducting negotiations, is that digital media has not yet changed negotiation strategy. We're confident that it should and must, and we're excited to share with you one of the most important breakthroughs in negotiation strategy, which involves extending the tools and capabilities of 3D negotiation by using social media. Now, let me turn things over to my colleagues, Jim Sebanius and Ben Cook. Jim, take it away.
Hi, I'm Jim Sebanius, professor at Harvard Business School and co-founder of Laxabanius. I am delighted you've joined us today. I look forward to giving you an overview of our work on how social media can kill or enhance your deals. This is work we've been doing for a while, and its potential for greatly increasing negotiators' effectiveness is huge. Let me give you a sense of how this came about. As we increasingly realized the importance of this topic, we scoured the literature for good research, found little, and so we asked top negotiation scholars for what they'd found and for their advice. And typically their answers were, good question, I can't think of anything that's relevant, or the classic academic answer, great dissertation topic for somebody else. In response, we put together a panel of really excellent academics and senior negotiation practitioners on this topic last May at a Harvard Research Conference on AI, tech, and negotiation. And the work from this conference provides much of the intellectual foundation for today's presentation. Now, when I talk about academic work, of course, we're very active in the world of practice. So we asked some quite experienced negotiators of their experiences and their insights. How important is social media to your negotiations? What are some best practices? Where are some big mistakes? What advice would you give for doing this? And I'd have to say the answers were not encouraging, much more than the academics. So, for example, I was interviewing with a few colleagues, former Secretary of State John Kerry, and here's the question I asked, and I think you'll find a brief clip of his response interesting.
There's an image of negotiation that's kind of an old one, that's of, people in a small room figuring things out. And yet in a world of social media, it strikes me that the role of social media is much greater and in fact, first order with respect to ongoing negotiations. And I'm curious, is that perception accurate? And are there best practices and big mistakes one can make as a negotiator vis-a-vis social media?
Oh, sure. I mean, first of all, you want to try to stay away from it. And I think what it's done is it's probably appropriately driven negotiations into a much more secret private track. I I would try to do a lot more in secret than we were doing back then, and with a smaller group, in effect. I think that you need to not let the externals come in and screw up your ability to have the dynamic you create.
So John Kerry's advice was pretty unequivocal. Stay away from it. Social media only offers downsides for negotiation. But of course, some other very public figures very eagerly use social media to intervene in negotiations. Some famous tweets from Donald Trump to his then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, and in his negotiations with Kim Jong-un. And it's not clear that that was very effective either. So to figure out how to use social media effectively, we need to really know what we're talking about. And beyond Twitter, beyond Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, the very well-known platforms, it turns out that there are many social media platforms with very valuable open source data. There are also many general tools to help analyze this data. But in the public domain, these tools are not really customized to meet the needs of sophisticated negotiators. And to use the customized tools that we've developed at Laxabanius, I want to turn to some work that many of you will be familiar with, coming from the book 3D Negotiation that David and I wrote some years ago. And the insight that I think is especially relevant to the use of social media is that many times moves away from the table to set up the most promising possible situation are often the keys to successful negotiation. And so as a core part of an integrated 3D negotiation strategy, social media can provide a valuable means for making such moves. And so the question arises, what are these moves, these classes of action that use social media in an ethical manner to boost the odds of reaching a target deal? And the first is a classic need for effective negotiation, which is to explore and learn much more about the parties to a negotiation, who they are, both actually and potentially, and who's directly or indirectly influential. That function of who the parties are, what their interests are, what a sense of no deal or their batnas might be, the relationships to others, possible coalitions. These are all important factors about which you can learn using social media. That's a key function. Of course, in negotiation, you want to learn, but you also want to influence the other side to say yes or to support a yes. And so wielding more effective influence is something that social media in a number of circumstances can do quite well. Direct influence, you can anticipate the other side's likely points, frame messages that'll resonate, avoid messages that are likely backfire, and indirectly to communicate via other respected sources, that is, sources that the other side respects or pays attention to or defers to, then can potentially sway the more directly involved parties. So social media can be helpful for influence purposes. Moreover, trying to build support for your position and for the deal, your target deal you're trying to reach, you sometimes need to mobilize supporters in close and at a distance. And of course, since they're often opponents, you need to deter and neutralize those, for which social media can be quite effective. So when we put these various pieces together, we have really the summary of social media can be used ethically to boost the odds of reaching a target deal by helping you to learn, to influence, to mobilize, and to neutralize. And today's webinar is the first of 3 that we've planned that explore how these functions play out in very different negotiations. In a moment, we want to see how social media played a critical role for Amazon, a huge company, in a politically charged situation. In a seminar whose time and place we'll let you know as soon as we've tied it down, the role of social media in a medium-sized hospital negotiation dealing with a very tough union organizing process. and finally, a very small company dealing with what for it was a potentially fatal local controversy. Thank you. Ben, over to you.
Hi, my name is Ben Cook, and I'm Vice President of Laxabanius LLC, a firm that advises companies and governments in complex negotiations, as well as the founder of Red Pill Strategies, a boutique strategy shop focused on helping organizations navigate the many high-stakes challenges they face operating in today's 24/7 digital jungle. While many businesses think of social media as a channel for reach, a place to take their existing strategy and connect with new audiences, we flip that formula on its head. So rather than going from strategy to social, we start with a deep understanding of social media, and then develop approaches that are native to the digital age, informed by data-backed recommendations that help negotiators better understand their online threats and emerging opportunities. In turn, then this understanding should help shape negotiating strategy. So what do I mean by all that? Well, in this webinar, I'll be walking you through a case study using Amazon's failed bid for a second headquarters in New York City, so-called HQ2. If you're not familiar, this proposed project would have provided a total of 50,000 high-paying jobs, a juicy development prize that sparked a high-profile competition between more than 230 cities across North America. In late 2018, Amazon announced New York as one of 2 lucky winners, splitting the jobs evenly, with 25,000 to Long Island City and 25,000 to a suburb of DC. Amazon felt like it was in a strong position. When it was announced, the deal had widespread local support in New York, including 80% of registered voters in Queens, the borough where the campus was going to be built, a majority of union workers in the city, despite Amazon's somewhat spotty reputation with organized labor, and even higher levels of support among minority communities. Across the board, a statewide majority of every age group, every ethnicity, every political leaning, and all educational backgrounds approved of Amazon's plan. Both the governor and the mayor were vocal advocates, with the governor even joking that he would change his name to Amazon Cuomo if they would pick New York. But somehow, despite this overwhelming support, it didn't take long for a tiny minority of local opponents to emerge as a real problem. Small-scale protests cropped up around the city, but it was online where these voices became especially dominant. Several themes emerged in this anti-Amazon conversation, including broader criticisms about its reputation for being anti-union or mistreating its warehouse workers, as well as allegations that the e-commerce giant damages small businesses and evades taxes. For the HQ2 project specifically, opponents claimed it would put a strain on infrastructure and hike up rent nearby, and they complained about New York giving a $3 billion tax break to an already rich company that hadn't paid income tax in recent years, and that was headed by Jeff Bezos, the world's wealthiest man. You can see here a photo that went massively viral of these demonstrators at a particular city council hearing at which the Amazon proposal was under discussion. So when Amazon first learned of these protests, its approach, as summarized in this Bloomberg article about the inner workings of the small, secretive negotiating team behind the deal, was essentially to ignore the problem. Internally, the strategy was apparently summarized as F you or Amazon, because this insulated group was so convinced of the economic desirability of this deal, of positive popular sentiment, and the strong support of all of New York's top politicians, that all they had to do was announce a winner and get to work. Yet, to the surprise of one of the biggest, most tech-savvy companies in the world, this strategy did not work out very well for them. And by the way, negotiations experts call this approach decide, announce, defend, a kind of take-it-or-leave-it strategy that my colleague Jim Sabanius analyzed in a recent Harvard Business Review article about this case. And so as pressure mounted across social media, a prominent opponent of the deal, who had initially been a supporter, State Senator Michael Gianaris, was nominated by the State Senate to what's called the Public Authorities Control Board, a key policy body with oversight over the deal terms that required unanimity among its members to approve the project. This effectively handed veto power to a deal blocker, And so at that point, after repeated public humiliations, the company withdrew their offer, and New York lost out on those 25,000 high-paying jobs, alongside an estimated $28 billion in new tax revenue for the state. So our question here is, how did an unfunded, ad hoc group of amateur online activists defeat one of the most valuable, tech-savvy, well-connected companies in the world over a multi-billion-dollar deal with such strong local support? To begin getting our heads around this David versus Goliath defeat, we're going to utilize a tool from the field of social media intelligence and use it to visualize the universe of conversation around Amazon's HQ2 deal in Long Island City. Although there are, of course, many different platforms we could have examined, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, to name just a few, in this case, our analysis is limited to Twitter network visualization because that's where the bulk of the HQ2 conversation took place. And in future webinars, we'll explore some of those other channels and tools in a little bit more depth. So what you're looking at here is a network graph analyzing Twitter conversation around the time of a pivotal City Council hearing on the HQ2 project. The dots represent individual Twitter users, the lines are conversations between them, and their position in relation to each other is a measure of importance or influence within the conversation. For those interested in the network theory behind this visual, this is called eigenvector centrality. It's the same math behind Google's PageRank algorithm that determines what sites come up when you search a term. So if we dive into this graph, the first observation we have is how utterly peripheral Amazon is to this conversation. You can see Amazon's Twitter presence here, encircled in a red dot. And if you note their position within the network, you'll see that the tech giant was almost completely absent on Twitter and had essentially no ability to influence or shape debate, frame perceptions of the deal. It's remarkable. And ultimately, this oversight meant that they had no leverage on this vital platform to shape the outcome of their deal. But if Amazon wasn't driving this conversation, who was? Who was shaping the way that New Yorkers perceived this deal? Well, as you can see here, the conversation was overwhelmingly dominated by anti-Amazon activists, specifically supporters of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Their activity has made her one of the most mentioned accounts in this network, even though she herself hasn't actually posted. This is referred to as having high in degree. Now, AOC had just won a shock upset victory over a well-established incumbent Democratic politician in a nearby district. And the coalition of hyper-online local progressives that propelled her to victory was knowledgeable about the area, extremely digitally savvy, and was equipped from the campaign with a trove of social media accounts and connections of supporters just waiting to be activated to oppose a deal like this one. And you can see here various leaders in her camp doing just that. For example, this account is Zephyr Teachout, an author and Fordham law professor popular among the Bernie Sanders AOC crowd. Democratic socialist-aligned influencers like her are the ones engaging every day, sharing the posts that went viral and reached the most people, and playing a pivotal role in shaping how this conversation evolved. In fact, she has the highest betweenness centrality in this network, meaning she is the channel through which the largest number of new users are being brought into the conversation. And this is where it gets really interesting. In this graph, you see a group of Democratic Socialist accounts literally surrounding one user, State Senator Michael Gianaris. He's the one I mentioned earlier, the opponent whose appointment to the unanimous consent-based Public Authorities Control Board ultimately derailed the deal. Now, what's curious about Senator Gianaris is that he was a lifelong moderate, a middle-of-the-road, largely pro-development, pro-union individual. And remember, a majority of union workers in the city supported the deal, despite Amazon's troubled history with organized labor. In fact, in Senator Gianaris' district, State Senate District 12, which includes the proposed HQ2 campus in Long Island City, 77% of voters approved of this project. And so maybe unsurprisingly, the senator actually had been supportive of early efforts to attract Amazon to the city. But after Gianaris saw the hyper-online AOC movement topple another moderate Democrat in a neighboring district, he swiftly moved to the left and began embracing these often largely symbolic, highly viral progressive stands. It got to the point where this lifelong moderate began calling himself the Amazon Slayer online and in the media. And when you look at this network, it's no surprise why he changed his mind about bringing Amazon to his district. When it came to lobbying Senator Gianaris, this coalition of anti-development, democratic socialist users completely drowned out all other voices online. So this obviously created quite a problem for Amazon and its majority of local support. But before we get into that, I have one final observation to make about this network. Conversation here is driven and defined by these small-scale, highly active users who often have very few followers, but are engaged in this peer-to-peer conversation where they are talking to individuals in different groups across different constituencies, forming the bridges that tie this network together. In network theory terms, these users have high betweenness centrality, but low closeness centrality. In other words, they might not have all that many friends, but they are key to connecting otherwise distinct clusters to each other. In essence, what you're seeing here is the real-time formation of a hostile digital coalition. These users are the ones responsible for the overwhelmingly anti-Amazon sentiment online. But who are they? Well, they are almost exclusively immigration rights activists, like this account, Make the Road NY. But this is somewhat bizarre. On the face of it, this deal had nothing to do with immigration rights. Instead, these users had a separate bone to pick with Amazon over its Web Services Division's contract with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and they believed the company had been insufficiently responsive to their demands. And so even though they had no interest in the specifics of the HQ2 deal, this was an opportunity for them potentially to exert outsized leverage over the company. What this shows is that any public negotiation like this presents a unique vulnerability to activist pressure that might be completely unrelated to the specifics of the deal at hand, but which can become pivotal when focused on crucial individuals or influential decision-making bodies. We're not just talking about good community outreach or social media listening, although both are important for public affairs more broadly. We're talking about this specific small-scale group of users who successfully targeted key digital pressure points like Senator Gianaris, induced him to change his position on the deal, and then lobbied the state Senate for his appointment to the consensus-based Public Authorities Control Board. It was these users and their disproportionately impactful online behavior that led to the defeat of Amazon's coalition with mass local support. And with Amazon's negotiating team absent from Twitter, the company was unable to identify, or at least respond to, the growing influence of these activists until it was too late, much less influence the debate or mobilize supporting coalitions effectively. Look, what's significant about this case is not that Amazon is bad at negotiating. It's that Amazon appears to have been largely blind to the realities of the situation on the ground and online. Despite their year-long media blitz hyping up the deal's benefits and goosing up competition among hundreds of cities to win this prize, it looks like Amazon mostly failed to monitor, or at least to counter, the huge volume of conversation its PR team had generated in anything like a sophisticated way. While the typical explanation for this failure is that Jeff Bezos overlooked the AOC Worm Hidden in New York's Big Apple, as this editorial cartoon depicts, to us, Amazon's most glaring oversight was its failure to mobilize that broad base of latent local support in meaningful ways to counter the much smaller but more intensely engaged opposing forces. After Amazon announced that it would withdraw from the deal, A huge group of union leaders, local elected officials, and community leaders wrote an open letter in the New York Times imploring Bezos to reconsider. How did Amazon miss this potentially pivotal support before it was too late? This group includes 4 House representatives, many community organizations from Long Island City, the president of the state NAACP, the president of the New York State AFL-CIO, the president of the Civil Service Employees Association, a union with more than 300,000 members in New York. But online, none of these people show up influencing Senator Gianaris. Now, look, hindsight is 20/20. But had we been advising Amazon, it seems pretty clear that at least some portion of this support might have been activated in useful ways. For example, Amazon could have identified influential supporters based on their social media following or networked position in key communities, equipped them with powerful arguments they could personalize and adapt for different audiences, and use top-down corporate communications to amplify these positive voices. Amazon could have identified specific concerns of opponents and moved swiftly to mitigate them. Or on the flip side, they could have employed the same bottom-up tactics used by activists on Senator Gianaris to potentially retain or reclaim his support. In the weeks leading up to his appointment to the Oversight Board, when Senator Gianaris was refusing to even attend the Community Advisory Committee they had set up to discuss this deal, would he really have refused a meeting with labor leaders about the 11,000 potential union construction and maintenance jobs the project was set to bring to his district? And efforts like these could have been augmented with tailored messages narrowly targeted to reach key groups of stakeholders online. This outreach could have highlighted a wider set of implications from losing this deal. Lost jobs, lost infrastructure improvements, lost sales tax, even the lost ability for progressive leaders to influence the company over the long term, which was actually a key issue that major New York labor leaders raised after the deal was lost. It's unlikely that Amazon could have changed the minds of the ICE protesters organizing to oppose this deal. But the company might very well have worked with Senator Gianaris before he changed his mind, maybe inducing him to embrace the deal, or at least stay on the sidelines, by letting him hear from someone other than this hyper-online activist minority. For example, working with Amazon, he could have become the city's most visible agent, helping meet the concerns of protesters and opponents, announcing agreements and victories to key digital constituencies. We can't know for sure if this approach would have been successful in the end, but with key decision makers stuck in an anti-Amazon echo chamber online, failure was all but guaranteed. Had Amazon employed tools and approaches like the ones we've been exploring, they might not have been so blind to the support for HQ2 on the ground and online. Performing a quick red team-style audit of their key vulnerabilities and attack surfaces could have helped the company detect these issues before they announced the selection of New York, observe troubling shifts early, and act swiftly to neutralize hostile actors by meeting their concerns, outflanking them, or simply overwhelming them with mobilized supporters. The social media intelligence approach we're talking about could have helped the company act quickly to improve their deal landscape by bringing more pro-HQ2 voices to bear in the negotiation, either indirectly via social media or directly by engaging prominent supporters such as labor leaders who could have lobbied elected officials in the state Senate to have someone else appointed to the Public Authorities Control Board. But armed with a traditional toolkit, Amazon failed to mobilize its supporting coalition in a meaningful way. So regardless of how you feel about the merits and specifics of this project as proposed, there was some form of a deal to be made here. And in the end, Amazon's blindness resulted in everyone losing out on that opportunity. Thank you. And thank you very much for taking the time to walk through this case study with us. As you've seen, these approaches have the potential to be transformative in crucial negotiations. And remember, this graphical network analysis is just one tool out of many such social media analysis tools, and one platform, Twitter, out of dozens of sources for intelligence and influence online. In future webinars, we'll be discussing several additional approaches we've been developing to support our clients facing important or high-stakes deals, including proactively building resiliency across their organizations, and mining sources like Facebook or Instagram for pivotal information to shape strategy in a far more in-close setting. Now I'll turn it back over to Jim to expand a bit more on how we're integrating social media into the 3D negotiation approach more broadly. Thank you.
Hello again. I hope you found that to be a fascinating presentation. I think it's quite unexpected how powerful social media can be in negotiation. Ben's offered you a number of lessons and suggestions for this, but I'd like to give you a few parting thoughts that maybe will help summarize what we've seen. Few things. This, of course, was a social media failure and a negotiation failure for Amazon. But on the other hand, it was perceived to be quite a success for the deal opponents, kind of a David successfully defeats Goliath. In our view, though, as students and practitioners of negotiation, we think a genuinely successful deal could have been possible in this circumstance. It would have generated thousands of direct and indirect jobs, billions for taxes, improved infrastructure, housing, services, and many of the concerns of the stakeholders could have been met through negotiation, but it would have required a different social media and broader strategy by Amazon. I think this case also illustrates the old dangers of a decide, announce, defend approach to negotiation. You may think your deal is so good or your position so strong that that's all you have to do. But among negotiation types, we often refer to decide, announce, defend as having additional A. Instead of dad, it becomes dada, which is decide, announce, defend, abandon. And I'm afraid that's what happened here. Big takeaways. I think the first is that social media is likely to be part of many negotiations. It's something you should anticipate, and it can enhance or kill your deal. And what I hope we've illustrated in this case is that as a key part of your negotiation strategy of reaching your target deal on a sustainable basis, social media tools can enable you to learn, influence, mobilize supporters, and/or neutralize opponents, while at the same time respecting important privacy and ethical concerns. This is true both before, during, and after the deal. I'd like to turn this back over to David, and with my thanks for your paying attention, and I hope you found this to be intriguing and useful. Dave?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Ben, for a great presentation and summary. And I want to point out before we head into question and answers that this is some of our latest research and new ideas that we think are very valuable. They're just a part of what we do both in research on negotiation and as advisors and consultants in negotiation. So this is, the social media is one tool among many as we work on M&A deals and commercial transactions and governmental negotiations of various kinds. But we think it's very exciting and we wanted to share it with you. So, but we want to thank you for joining. We just are pleased to be able to share sort of new frontiers for us with all of you. So thank you very much. On that note, I think we'll take a look at the questions that we have. And okay, question number one for Professor Sebenius. Why is it important to be ethical in the use of these social media tools? Is that something that you identified early on?
Well, I think it's a really important question because ethical and privacy concerns are everywhere with respect to social media. And but I'd like us to keep in mind that the oldest advice in negotiation is to understand the other side, who they are, what they care about, to whom they listen, and so forth. And you try to persuade them to say yes. At bottom, social media permits this to be done in a vastly more efficient fashion. And frankly, the same ethics that you would traditionally apply in negotiations that didn't involve social media. All sorts of illegitimate means. You wouldn't hire private detectives, dig through people's garbage, blackmail others to get information. Those sorts of ethical considerations apply to the use of social media as well. But I think it's urgently important, especially in these days, to stress that any user of this kind of open source information by negotiators really has to be guided by considerations of privacy and ethics. Because, you know, you can't use these things for special purposes like hacking or embarrassing a counterpart or spreading virus or committing fraud or identity theft. And there are official rules on these things, of course, such as those in the European Union's General Data Protection regulations. And those who would use social media to learn, influence, and mobilize others should really take some privacy and ethical considerations into account. And failure to do so risks, I think, and we think, the very real likelihood of causing harm, damaging reputations, undercutting legitimacy, and frankly, backfiring.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. She asked if, in effect, these are great for retrospective analyses, but can you also do this in real time? Because it makes it harder it's hard to do this in real time. And so the question is, and I'll turn that over. The answer is yes, you can do it in real time, but let me turn things over to Ben to make a couple of observations, then I will as well.
Yeah, sure. Great question. I would actually say it's a little easier. When you're doing this sort of historic look back, there's so much about the broader context that gets brought to bear in the negotiation that you have to sort of do your historical research to understand. Whereas if you're doing it in real time, it's much easier to get a broader sense of the entire landscape of things that might be relevant to the deal. And I think that's also important, just to reiterate a point that Jim and I both made, which is that in this case study, we're using one tool, looking at one platform. But if you're doing this in real time, it's easy to get a much broader sense of the landscape using a wide variety of tools and platforms. And then we have a number of sort of frameworks and methodologies that we use to sort of try to distill that vast universe of conversation down to something that's digestible, understandable, and then ultimately actionable in a negotiation.
I would say I'd add two things there. One is, one of the analyses that we did here was snapshots over time. And so we didn't present that to you because we had a limited amount of time, but we actually, you could see things forming over time. So that, and it also identifies potential ways to respond quickly. So, we saw we would have seen, I think, opportunities to intervene before the coalition had been fully formed. Both, again, in person and digitally. Okay. Another question here. Do you know why the groups behind the open letter, which was ex post, why they didn't engage on their own in the Twitterverse? Why didn't this happen without Amazon doing anything?
I think this is something that has happened a lot, and it often is a result of a kind of arrogance and certainty about the way things happen and the way negotiations are done. Something quite similar actually happened in Boston when Boston was awarded the Olympics recently, and like Amazon in New York City, there was support from the governor, from the mayor, from a whole lot of prominent citizens, and the appeal seemed so self-evident, and the high-level support was so obvious that perhaps it didn't seem necessary to mobilize in advance the kinds of support that might have been there. Now, I'm not saying that was necessarily a good deal or that was a bad outcome, but I think that this is very common. And I think, if you were Amazon in this situation and 238 cities were competing for this prize, and you were successful out of all of those, or New York was successful out of all of those would be new headquarters locations. You might just assume that this is a slam dunk. You don't really need to do anything more. And I think with the kind of support that was visible among the political leadership and so forth, it was easy to forget that power now is often decentralized. And I think Ben's sort of analysis along the way really showed that. The other point I would make is that without tracking that in real time, you really don't know what may well be about to hit you. And so tracking it, as well as thinking about the moves away from the table, I think the crucial difference between 3D and many other kinds of negotiations, you're likely not to succeed, or at least there's a much bigger risk of that.
So we have two questions that address a similar topic. One says, this case illustrates how social media intelligence can be employed principally in a defensive debate shaping mode. And the question is, how does an organization determine that it's in its best interest to proactively shape the debate? And another question says, well, what are the risks if you try to be proactive?
Sure. Yeah. I think, and actually I would note that we have a couple additional webinars coming up where we talk, about some of the things that people can do ahead of time, sort of build resiliency or be more proactive or even gain an advantage in a negotiation. This particular case is very focused on that kind of, defensive, how do you protect yourself from this kind of undue influence, unwanted influence. I would say, in terms of broad issues with taking a more proactive stance, there are times when the company is sort of what we would refer to as reputation capital is low and low among key parties to the negotiation. And so there are times when you want to tap surrogates to deliver messages in a credible way. So I would say you still want to be proactive, but you might want to do it in a way that's one step removed from your own sort of corporate communications channels, so that you have a little bit more reputational capital to gain influence or gain the ear of the people you want to influence in this deal.
Okay, so somebody asked here, are there social media moves the city and state of New York could have or should have carried out on their side to create the right ecosystem for the Amazon deal? Interesting question.
I think that in many respects, if you're really for something, you as various city and state, and it turns out union, and really across much of civil society, those groups had just as much stake in forming an active supportive coalition as Amazon did in succeeding with its first choice among states. And so I think a coordinated effort would have made a lot of sense. The other thing that would have happened is I think many of the objections would have turned up there. That was the infrastructure adequate to handle this new influx? Would it drive up housing prices? Would the subways and bus lines handle things? Would there be would small businesses suffer as a result of this? How about unions? And then there was a big one, that a tax break of what would amount to $3 billion was going to New York. And as that surfaced and became a big political issue, frankly, the supporters of the deal were completely behind the eight ball, and it became as if the city was just granting $3 billion to this big company that didn't pay taxes and so forth, as opposed to saying, instead of their paying $31 billion in taxes over the life of the project, instead they would pay $28 billion. And if the project didn't happen, none of that would be paid. And each of those objections, I think, has some validity, but there could have been a negotiation that engaged those, and once they were turned up, and really been ahead of, rather than behind, this onrush of objections and questions.
Okay, so here's a question related to that. I understand, how you'd use social media in the ways you described, or the uses and benefits. But what should you do beforehand to enhance your reputation so that you improve enhance the benefits of the social media actions that you're going to take later? So what reputational enhancement steps could an organization be taking today so that when they need to engage in social media in a negotiation, it's more effective?
I can take a quick stab at that. I think one of the features of social media that's really interesting for negotiation is that so much of what goes viral, what gets shared, is symbolic and has an emotional bent to it. And so a lot of the logical arguments and things like that that you might make to say this, for example, HQ2 is going to be objectively good for New York City, don't really gain much traction on social. And so one of the things you can do to try to sort of proactively build up your reputation capital is just attract a large enough audience so that you're able to tap into, and get your message across, sort of cut through the clutter of all of those different competing emotional messages. And I would say that our next webinar is going to really focus on that. We're giving an example of a hospital executive who was able to sort of proactively build a following so that when a union came to sort of organize within his hospital, he really had almost a bully pulpit where he was able to deliver his message in a way that inoculated the organization and his key stakeholders against that influence. But I would say overall, the big thing that you want to do is understand where reputationally you're vulnerable ahead of time, and then put in place plans to build up resiliency rather than just sort of broadly saying, we're investing in marketing and our brand and things like that. You really want to cultivate your influence in this sphere.
There's also a difference between your general reputation, which I don't think Amazon could have affected much with respect to this specific deal, but your reputation with regard to particular questions and issues is something that once you've identified areas of vulnerability, especially online, you can act and you can take the initiative to shore up. And as Ben has said, in a lower profile national situation, but one that mattered considerably in a significant city, in the next webinar that we'll do, we'll see how prior action on social media to build up one's reputation and credibility paid off enormously in a very, very difficult negotiation. And frankly, this isn't too different from negotiation in general. One of the big assets you have is your reputation. If there are people who, and your network and your reputation, and if there are people you can draw on in a standard negotiation, absent any social media, who like you, who respect you, who believe what you say, and are at all related to the process, you're going to be much better off. You'll have more assets to deploy. And there's an online analog to that we'll specifically illustrate next time. But I think here would have been possible with respect to these particular pieces.
3 people asked variations of the same question. One is, in effect, are we recommending that you negotiate privately, kind of like John Kerry, which might actually be more like an ostrich putting his head in the sand, and second, somebody else asked, how should we allocate effort from the social media strategy toward the other parts of negotiation strategy? I think the answer, is in a wonderful world, everything would be private. In today's world, nothing is private. I've always said that, even though companies sign NDAs, you should assume that, and especially outside of countries where legal frameworks are very strong, you should assume that NDAs don't really mean anything. In this case, I think you should assume that things will enter the public domain in various ways. So let me turn it over to Jim and Ben, but I would say the idea that we should follow John Kerry and try to do everything in secret would be very hard to do.
It really depends. I think you're absolutely right, Dave, but it really depends on the kind of negotiation. Because if you think that you're looking toward a deal where the parties who will be contracting are pretty much the only ones who are affected by or much influenced by the negotiation, and other people, might notice it but don't really care about it, and it doesn't affect them directly or indirectly, or they don't have a bone to pick with, with one of the players for an unrelated reason, the way the immigration activists did with respect to the New York Amazon deal. If that's the case, I don't think you need to worry too much about social media. So purely private negotiations without external stakeholders, I think are, that's something where you don't need to worry about the kind of issue that was on display in New York with Amazon. However, we look at the next couple of webinars, you'll see some examples of where even in close negotiations, without really any meaningful public focus, where social media could be used to learn and understand your counterparts much better in close, and figure out sources of commonality, sources of influence, things to stay away from, just by looking at readily available information that's out there in the public. You just understand your counterpart much better. And you also might want to look at yourself and see where they might see that you are vulnerable or susceptible to this or to that. So it's not just these big public deals, but there's a wholly different and much more private set of uses for social media. What stuns us, I want to take you back to really one of our first observations. When one of our colleagues was putting together this artificial intelligence technology and negotiation framework, or a conference, academic research conference, the question of social media and negotiation came up. The great focus was on negotiating by Zoom or by Microsoft Teams or otherwise, and how do you comport yourself differently and so forth, and the issues of negotiating electronically versus by email versus in person, which are important. There are a lot of people who've talked about that, and it's an interesting subject. But in terms of the broader uses of social media, it's fascinating that as influential as social media have been across the board, socially, in business and otherwise, they really haven't explicitly touched that of negotiation, which is why we're really working to customize the tools and concepts so that they can enhance enhance the approach.
Okay. There's a related question here. Somebody asked whether companies that are, how we differ in what we'd say to B2B companies versus B2C companies. In a B2C company, they're dealing with the consumer, so the brand matters a lot, all the public perceptions matter a lot, whereas in a B2B company, it's less clear. And I would say, and I'll let Ben jump in after I make one comment, which is we're currently advising in a negotiation, B2B. If they posted the deal on a website, no one would look, except for competitors. So it's never going to get traction in the media, except for people falling asleep and dying. But we used briefly, we did some work analyzing all the people in the negotiation, all the parties on the other side, and we found the key negotiator on the other side. We identified one of his hobbies, which we were able to bring up in a negotiation. And we also observed that every executive who's involved in the negotiation on the other side is following search firms, with executive search firms, which probably indicates there's a level of insecurity in that company about their positions and the viability of their business. Both of which I thought, were not dispositive, but they were interesting in enabling a bit about the conversation that our clients had with them. Ben, can I turn it over to you to?
Yeah. Thanks, David. I really liked that particular case. I think one of the things to just note here is that when we're talking about social media, the whole digital age has become so deeply embedded in every aspect of our lives. Obviously, we're doing this over Zoom now, but just from start to finish, every aspect of our days has moved online. And so there are, in this case, we used Twitter network analysis, and I've sort of adapted some of the open source network graphing tools that are out there to analyze this big public negotiation. But in other instances, we're adapting any number of tools, approaches, platforms to the specific needs of different cases. I think social media is a landscape that evolves so quickly. A year ago, no one would have talked about TikTok. Today, it's a pretty high priority issue. I think there are any number of ways in which you might use the specific platforms, the specific tools, and that's why we tried to broadly bucket into those categories of learn, influence, mobilize, neutralize, because I think whether it's very in close, whether it's life or death, or you're just trying to seek, a small advantage in a large-scale negotiation, this world is not going away, and it's something to sort of proactively start weaving in at every step along the way of a negotiation.
Okay. Thank you. So two other related questions. One says, Jim, you've interviewed many U.S. Secretaries of State. How do you see these tools being used in diplomatic situations? Any recent examples beyond Trump? Someone asked whether, how and whether Trump is using these tools to influence votes. And and is it working? And so, Jim, let's start with the Secretaries of State.
Sure. I mentioned the Harvard conference where we put together a really sterling panel of practitioners and academics. And among the practitioners were two sort of diplomatic players who work closely with foreign ministries and otherwise, in one case an ambassador, and talked about how behind many foreign ministries, foreign affairs specialists, and otherwise are with respect to social media. They know that these are important channels, but in many cases, social media, Twitter, and otherwise are just another channel to put out a press release, and you would have used fax or email before. That's beginning to change. So for example, digital listening to monitor where the various cross currents are going can be helpful. And something that we'll provide more information on is just in the day-to-day life of a quite senior diplomat, how these things in fact can be used. But I would say at the moment, if you ask the question, what are best practices? What are big mistakes? What's the advice you would give? It's very ad hoc, and it's clear that sort of digital diplomacy is kind of in its infancy. But that's a topic that we're doing, and frankly, I believe there'll be a couple of articles that we'll put out, and we'll link to those with some of our colleagues who are primarily in diplomacy.
So here's an interesting and different cut. Somebody asked whether one can or should negotiate with one's counterpart on how to jointly influence and shape the negotiation as a proactive move. And I assume that the notion there is how to shape the perceptions of the negotiation with respect to the outside world.
That's an interesting question, because one of the hallmarks of really effective negotiators is working across the table to deal with potential opponents away from the table. And so sometimes, for example, a union leader and a company negotiator will be coming to what's really, as they see it, the only possible resolution that might work. And yet, on both sides, there are going to be dissident union members, and there are going to be people who will object to that on the corporate side. And the two negotiators and the senior people may well coordinate efforts, including on social media, to enable this deal to go forward. And you see analogs in that many times. How can I help the other side with their behind the table problem so that they're able to do what I'd like in my interest? There's that old quip from an Italian diplomat, Daniel Varre, that negotiation is the art of letting them have your way. How do you shape their choice such that what they choose for their reasons solves your problem? And you often see each side helping the other behind the table. I mean, deal with the other side's behind the table problems so that the resolution can happen. And there's a social media component to that piece.
Okay. And I'm going to do one last question here, I think, and I'll mention several people asked about the tools that we used or that are available. There are simultaneously a lot of platforms, a lot of tools. Very few of them easily fit what we're doing, so we're adapting to make them do what we want. So I won't go into detail there, but there are a lot of tools, available either for free or more likely for very high prices on the web to do certain parts of what we do, and there's a lot more available. But I won't go into that now. One question, just what other social media do you believe can effectively influence or neutralize the Twitter discussions? I think maybe toward the Amazon question, but more generally, what else? Ben, let me turn that over to you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I would just emphasize with that is that, it's so dependent on the specific constituencies that you're dealing with. So, I think I think being able to, analyze exactly who matters and then find the best platform to reach them. So in some cases that might be Facebook, that might be Instagram, that might very well be Reddit, TikTok, depending on who you're looking at, or it might even be a small message board. If you're dealing with an employee group who has an anonymous place where they organize. So I would, a bit of a hedge, but say that broadly, it really you go back to that 3D negotiation, careful party mapping, understand who matters and how to influence them.
And I guess last question, people asked us about outcomes here, and like, will Generis ever be reelected again? Have we talked to Amazon? Do they regret it? I don't believe, we have talked to Amazon, but I don't think we've ever gotten a statement of regret. With respect to Gianaris, I have no knowledge, but do we know anything, Ben, about his reelection prospects?
I believe he cruised to reelection. It's welcome to New York.
Yeah. Okay. So again, we want to thank you for joining. We just are pleased to be able to share sort of new frontiers for us with all of you. So thank you very much.
Right. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim, and the rest of the Laxabanius team.